The world was a symphony, and Kalen was born a conductor who could not read the music. He lived on Ethel, a planet that breathed as one being. Here, the ground itself was alive, a vast, interconnected network of root and mycelium that pulsed with a slow, deep rhythm, a Gaia mind that dreamt in epochs. The air shimmered with more than just heat. It was thick with spores and pollen that carried not just life, but information whispers of rainfall from the western mountains, warnings of rock falls in the northern canyons, the sweet, sad scent of a great beast passing. The Athelans, his people, were not masters of this world, but were an intrinsic part of it, their bloodstreams hosting symbiotic flora that allowed them to feel the planet's hum in their bones and understand the spore song in the wind. Kalen, however, was a weaver, one of the rare few whose connection ran deeper, a direct conduit to the Gaia mind. For the elders, this connection was a placid river of knowledge. For Kalen, it was a raging, unpredictable sea. He could feel the world's pain with an acuity that was a constant, low-grade agony. Lately, the pain had sharpened. He would walk through the Cinderwood, a place that should have been vibrant with the rustle of iron-hard bark and the chatter of arboreal hunters, and feel nothing. It was a silence more terrifying than any scream, a dead patch in the symphony of life where the Gaia mind had been severed. The blight. The elders called it a slow, creeping numbness that had been spreading for generations, a sickness in the very soul of their world. Kalen felt it as a personal failing, a dissonance in his own spirit that he could not resolve. He was training under Lyra, an elder weaver whose face was a roadmap of seasons and sorrows. She taught him patience, urging him to listen rather than command, to be a vessel for the world's will, not a dam against it. But patience felt like a luxury as the dead zones expanded, as the spore song grew fainter, more desperate. Then the sky broke. It did not come with the fury of a storm or the glory of a meteor. It was a slow, geometric violation, a sterile shape ascending to blot out their sun. It was not a fleet of ships, but a single, colossal vessel, so vast that it seemed to bend the horizon around its edges. It was black, featureless, a void against the vibrant chaos of Ethel's sky. The Athelans called it the progenitor. It hung in the heavens like a judgment, silent and absolute. And for the first time in their history, the people of Ethel felt small, their world a fragile terrarium beneath an indifferent eye. The spore song became a single, keening note of pure panic, a planet-wide shriek that resonated in Kalen's skull until his teeth ached and his vision swam. He fell to his knees, clutching his head, the unfiltered terror of a billion living things flooding his senses. Lyra knelt beside him, her own face pale, placing a calming hand on his shoulder. "Breathe, child," she whispered, her voice a steady anchor in the psychic storm. "It is only a shadow. It cannot touch the heart of the world." But Kalen knew she was wrong. He could feel the heart of the world shuddering. The progenitor was not a passive observer. Days after its arrival, it birthed smaller things, metallic shards that descended on pillars of controlled fire, landing with a ground-shaking thud that was an insult to the soft, living earth. From these shards came figures, encased in sterile white suits that reflected the world without touching it. They moved with a purpose that was terrifying in its dispassion, their faces hidden behind dark visors. They were not warriors. They were scientists, collectors, the leader. A man Kalen would come to know as Dr. Eris Thorne stepped onto the soil of Ethel as if stepping into a laboratory. His every movement was precise, economical, devoid of wonder. Through the magnified lens of a drone that buzzed near Kalen's hiding place in the canopy, he could see the man's eyes. They were not filled with malice, but with a chilling, boundless curiosity. The look of a watchmaker peering at the cogs of a new and fascinating timepiece he was about to disassemble. Their tools were not weapons of overt war, but instruments of violation. They drove core samplers into ancient trees, their drills whining a dissonant chord against the world's hum. They trapped shimmering fauna in energy fields, their panicked cries silent to the human ear, but a deafening cacophony in Kalen's mind. They cataloged, tagged, and vivisected, their cold logic a poison seeping into the sacred places of the world. The true horror, however, began when they deployed the terraformers. These were not great machines that burned forests, but immense drills that plunged miles deep into the planet's crust. They were injecting something into the lifeblood of Ethel. Kalen didn't need to see it to know what it was. He felt it. A sudden, violent wrenching in his soul. A scream of a trillion severed connections as the Gaia mind in that region was cauterized. The symphony did not just gain a dissonant note. A whole section of the orchestra was suddenly, brutally silenced. The vibrant green of the forest floor turned a sickly, necrotic gray. The air grew still, the spore song replaced by an empty hiss. The humans had given the blight a name and a purpose. They called their poison null spores, and they were methodically murdering his world, one patch at a time, creating sterile zones from which to harvest its genetic code without interference. The Athelans convened in the Great Grove, the oldest part of the world, where the trees were sentient titans who remembered the birth of the mountains. Warriors, clad in the hardened hides of canyon predators and wielding spears of sharpened obsidian, demanded a direct assault. "We will strike them down," roared a chieftain named Borin, his voice like grinding rocks. "We will show these invaders the fury of Ethel." Lyra stood, her presence silencing the clamor. "Our connection to the Gaia mind is already strained by the blight," she warned, her voice heavy. "A direct attack is what they expect. Their suits are impervious to our claws, their machines to our spears. To fight them with brute force is to die a meaningless death." Kalen, still trembling from the psychic shockwave of the null spores, stumbled forward. "She is right," he rasped, his voice raw. "We cannot fight the machines, but we can fight with the world. The world is angry. I can feel it. It will help us if we ask." Borin sneered. "Ask the boy weaver wants to plead while our home is carved up for parts." The debate raged, but necessity soon forced their hand. A consortium harvester, a six-legged monstrosity of gleaming metal, began to crawl towards Kalen's own village, a small settlement nestled in a grove of ancestral whisperwood trees. Its purpose was clear to clear the area for another null spore injection. The warriors, led by Borin, mounted a valiant but futile assault. Their spears, thrown with incredible force, glanced off the machine's armored hull with pathetic clicks. Borin himself managed to scale one of its legs, only to be swatted away by an automated defense turret, his body thrown into the undergrowth like a broken doll. The harvester paused, its optical sensors glowing red as it recalibrated, and then resumed its inexorable advance. its great metal feet crushing the life from the sacred ground. Desperation clawed at Kalen's throat. He saw the faces of his kin, filled with terror, and the ancient whisperwood trees, whose pollen carried the memories of his ancestors. He closed his eyes, shutting out the sight of the approaching machine, and plunged his awareness deep, past the pain, past the fear, into the thrumming heart of the Gaia mind. He did not command or demand. That was the path to madness. He pleaded. He opened his own spirit, sharing his terror, his love for this small grove, his desperation. "Help us," he projected, a thought not of words, but of pure, raw emotion. "You are being wounded. Feel my pain. Feel your own." For a moment, there was nothing but the crushing silence of the blight. Then, he felt a response. Not a voice, but a surge of ancient, powerful intent. The ground beneath the harvester, solid moments before, suddenly softened, the rich soil loosening into a soupy morass. The machine's legs churned, sinking deeper into a newly formed sinkhole. Kalen felt a tingling in his arms as, all around the struggling machine, dormant razor vines, plants that could lie sleeping for a century, erupted from the earth, their thorny tendrils, hard as steel, whipped through the air, ensnaring the harvester's legs and joints, pulling it deeper into the mud. From the canopy above, a shimmering cloud descended, a swarm of fire wasps, drawn from miles away by a complex pheromonal distress signal Kalen had unconsciously broadcast, flooded the machine's vents and seams, their bodies generating a biological heat so intense it began to melt the inner circuitry. The harvester shuddered, its lights flickering, and with a final, grinding groan, it went silent. A captured beast tangled in the world's embrace. A cheer erupted from the Athelans. Kalen collapsed, his nose bleeding, the psychic effort having pushed him to his absolute limit, high above, invisible to the celebrating villagers. A consortium drone relayed the event to the progenitor. In the sterile command center, Dr. Eris Thorne watched the playback, his fingers steepled before his lips. The failed attack by the primitives was predictable, boring, but the ecological response, that was magnificent. The coordinated, multiphasic defense was too precise to be random. It was a directed, biological countermeasure. He had not come here to fight a war. He had come to harvest a unique genome. Now, he realized the most valuable part of that genome was not in the flora or fauna, but in the sentient catalyst that could wield the planet as a weapon. A small smile touched his lips. Isolate the energy signature from that pheromonal broadcast. He ordered an assistant, his voice calm and clear. Find its source. I want one of these weavers brought to me. Alive. The real work can now begin. On the ground, as his people celebrated their impossible victory, Kalen felt a sudden, ice-cold dread. He had not just saved his home. He had revealed his hand, proving his people were a threat to be neutralized. And in doing so, he had just made himself the most wanted creature on Ethel. The victory was a hollow drumbeat against the screaming silence of the blight. As the Athelans cautiously emerged from their hiding places, their initial cheers of relief quickly subsided, replaced by a profound unease. They gathered around the ensnared harvester, which now looked less like a vanquished foe and more like a tombstone, a monument to a war they had never wanted. The razor vines held it fast, their thorns digging into its metallic hide, and a slow, creeping moss had already begun to claim its surface. the planet itself already working to digest the foreign object. Kalen was on the ground, the world swimming back into focus in painful, jagged pieces. Lyra was beside him, her cool fingers pressing a poultice of silver leaf to his temples. The scent was calming, but it couldn't touch the psychic echo of the Gaia mind's exertion, a high-frequency ringing in the back of his mind. "You were reckless," she murmured, her voice laced with a mixture of pride and fear. "You reached too deep, too fast. The Gaia mind is not a spear to be thrown. Kalen, it is the ocean. To command a wave is to risk the entire tide." He pushed himself up, his body aching as if he'd been the one to physically restrain the machine. They were going to destroy the Whisperwood, Lyra. They were going to kill our ancestors' memories. His eyes found the broken form of Boren being carried back to the village by his warriors. The chieftain was alive, but his arm was bent at an unnatural angle, and a dark stain was spreading across his leather armor. Boren's eyes met Kalen's, and in them, Kalen saw not gratitude, but a burning, resentful fury. He had succeeded where the chieftain's strength had failed, and in their culture, that was a shift in power more potent than any formal decree. The celebration that night was a somber affair. The victory felt less like a triumph and more like a brief stay of execution. Kalen sat apart, the hero who no one dared approach, the source of their salvation and their greatest fear. The other Athelans could feel the shift in the world's rhythm, a new tension in the air. But only he and Lyra could truly hear the question the Gaia mind was now asking, what next high above, in the sterile blackness of the progenitor. Dr. Eris Thorne had his answer. The data from the drone was exquisite. He isolated the pheromonal burst, tracing its unique biosignature back to a single focal point, the boy. The subsequent ecological response was a cascade of biological triggers, a complex conversation between flora, fauna, and the planet's own geology. Thorne didn't see a miracle. He saw an operating system, a beautifully complex, powerful, and ultimately hackable system. And the boy, the Weaver, was the administrator with all the passwords. "Deploy the Spectres," Thorne said, his voice quiet in the hum of the ship's life support. "Stealth protocols. Mandate is non-lethal capture of the primary target. Sub-targets of similar biosignature are authorized for secondary acquisition. I want to know how this network functions." The Spectres descended not in pillars of fire, but as ghosts. They were humanoid, but their forms were slender, wrapped in chameleonic plating that sampled the surrounding light and texture, rendering them all but invisible. They moved with an unnatural silence, their feet making no sound on the forest floor, their equipment emitting no detectable energy. They were hunters, and Kalen was their prey. The Gaia mind warned him first. It was not a shout of alarm, but a sudden cold spot in the world's warmth, a place where the symphony of life seemed to skip a beat. He was walking the perimeter of the village when he felt it. A subtle wrongness, like a predator's shadow passing overhead. He stopped, closing his eyes, and listened. He could feel them, 3 of them, moving through the cinderwood to the east. They were holes in the world, their technology so alien that the Gaia mind could not properly perceive them, only register the blank space where life should be. He bolted, not back to the village, but away from it, deeper into the wilderness. He couldn't lead them to his people. His flight began. It was a terrifying education. He learned that his connection, His greatest gift was also a beacon. Every time he reached out to the Gaia mind for guidance, asking for the safest path or the location of his hunters, he left a psychic ripple they could trace. He had to learn a new way of being, to submerge himself in the world's flow so completely that his own consciousness was just another current in the great river of life. He ate what the world offered, slept in the hollows of ancient trees, and learned to speak to the Gaia mind not with pleas, but with quiet communion. He discovered the world had layers of consciousness. Beneath the immediate chatter of the forest was the slow, dreaming mind of the mountains, and beneath that, the molten, fiery heart of the planet itself. A power so vast and ancient it was almost incomprehensible. The specters were relentless. They learned as he did. When he used a cloud of disorienting pollen to cover his escape, they returned with filtered breathing systems. When he guided a rock slide to block a canyon pass, they reappeared with grav lifts that carried them over the obstruction. They were adapting, analyzing his every move. Dr. Thorn was teaching his hunters how to hunt a god. Kalen grew thin, his body hardened by the constant flight, but his spirit expanded. He was becoming less a boy and more a part of the landscape. One afternoon, hiding in a cave behind a waterfall, he felt the specters closing in. They were using sonic projectors to create a dead zone, a bubble of silence that dampened his connection to the wider world. He was trapped, isolated. Panic began to set in. Cold and sharp, he was about to try a desperate, violent appeal to the deep earth, a power that could cause an earthquake but might crack the very foundations of the land, when he felt another presence in the cave with him. Not a specter, but an Ethelyn, Lyra. She had followed him, using her own subtle connection to the world to track his path without alerting the hunters. Her face was etched with worry, but her eyes were steady. "You cannot outrun them forever, Kalen," she said, her voice a low whisper against the roar of the falls. "And you cannot burn down the forest to catch the wolf. That is their way, not ours." "They have cut me off," he said, his voice tight with fear. "I can't feel the world beyond this cave." "Then feel the world in this cave," she replied, gesturing to the walls around them. They were covered in phosphorescent fungi, glowing with a soft, blue light. "These are memory spores. They do not speak of the now, but of the deep past. Listen to them. Understand what this place is." He placed his palm against the cool, damp rock, and as Lyra guided him, he opened his mind not outwards, but inwards, to the life within the stone. He felt the slow, patient growth of the fungi, felt the millennia of memories stored in their mycelial network. He saw the formation of the cave, the great beasts that had sheltered here, the ebb and flow of water and time. And he saw something else. He saw how the fungi communicated, not with a broad psychic shout, but with subtle, localized shifts in light and chemical composition. It was a lesson, precision over power. The entrance to the cave darkened as two specters appeared, their invisible forms solidifying as they activated their capture equipment. Kalen looked at Lyra, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. He didn't need to cause an earthquake. He reached out to the memory spores, not with a command, but with a request, feeding them an image from his own mind. The cave was suddenly filled with light, the fungi flaring in a dazzling, strobing pattern. It was not random. It was a complex sequence designed to overload the optical sensors of the Spectre's helmets. Simultaneously, he encouraged the spores to release a concentrated burst of their essence. The air became thick with ancient memories, not just of Ethel, but of deep space, of dying stars and cosmic collisions. A billion years of sensory data compressed into a single moment. It was a psychic assault of pure information. The two specters staggered back, clutching their helmets, their sophisticated systems unable to parse the onslaught. But a third emerged from the shadows behind them, unaffected, its weapon raised. It had been shielded from the initial blast. Lyra moved before Kaelin could react. She did not attack. She stepped forward, placing herself between Kaelin and the Spectre, and opened her own mind. But her projection was not an attack. It was a shield, a wall of pure tranquility and peace, a psychic buffer that absorbed the Spectre's aggressive intent. The hunter hesitated, its weapon lowering a fraction of an inch, confused by the lack of hostility. In that moment of hesitation, Lyra sent a single, powerful thought directly to Kaelin. Run, learn, live. Then she collapsed, not from an attack, but from a targeted energy pulse from the Spectre's rifle that enveloped her in a shimmering blue field. The Spectre had recognized her as another Weaver, a secondary target. It had taken the bait. Kaelin watched in horror as they lifted Lyra's unconscious, floating form and retreated from the cave. Their mission accomplished. He was alone, the roar of the waterfall suddenly deafening in the silence of her absence. The Gaia mind felt his anguish, his rage, his loss, and the world outside the cave responded. The sky darkened, thunder cracked across the mountains, and a cold, hard rain began to fall. He had escaped, but the cost was unbearable. His flight was over. Now, his hunt was about to begin. He had a destination. He looked up, through the storm clouds, towards the black void that hung in his sky. He was going to get his teacher back. Kaelin did not run. He walked. Each step was a deliberate act of will, a conscious choice to move forward through the grief that threatened to root him to the spot. The G-mind mirrored his sorrow. The rain that had begun as a furious squall softened into a persistent, weeping drizzle that clung to the leaves and slicked the ancient stones. He walked out of the mountains and back toward the lowlands, toward the scarred earth where the consortium had established its primary research outpost. A sterile white wound festering in the heart of the forest. He knew going to his village was impossible. The consortium would be watching it, waiting for him to return. His path was now a solitary one. His purpose had been forged in the fire of Lyra's sacrifice. He was no longer just surviving. He was learning to fight. Lyra's final lesson in the cave had been a revelation. Precision over power. He had been using the G-mind like a club, and in doing so, had made himself a massive, easily detectable target. He now understood that he needed to become a scalpel. He spent his days in motion and his nights in deep communion, not with the broad consciousness of the planet, but with its individual components. He learned the language of the rocks, the slow, patient grammar of geology. He could feel the fissures and faults lines, the hidden hollows and the weak points in a cliff face. He learned the chemistry of the flora, understanding not just which plants were poisonous, but how to encourage them to release their toxins in a concentrated burst, or how to combine the pollen of two different species to create a paralytic agent on the wind. He learned to speak to the fauna, not as a master, but as an equal. He could calm the territorial fury of a pack of ridge stalkers, convincing them to let him pass. Or use the ultrasonic clicks of cave-dwelling bats to map the consortium's patrols in the darkness. He was reweaving his connection to the world, thread by delicate thread, becoming a part of its immune system. His target was the main consortium outpost, designated Outpost Prime. It was a sprawling complex of interconnected domes and landing pads surrounding the primary null spore injector. It was a fortress, shielded by energy barriers and patrolled by an army of robotic sentinels and human soldiers. A direct assault was suicide. He needed a way in, and he needed to understand his enemy. He began a slow, meticulous reconnaissance, never getting closer than a few miles, using the world as his sensory array. He guided deep-rooted trees to grow their root systems near the outpost's foundation, using their vibrations to feel the movement of vehicles and personnel within. He coaxed carrion birds to fly overhead, borrowing their keen eyesight for fleeting moments to glimpse the layout of the compound. He was building a map in his mind, not of the physical structure, but of its rhythms, its routines, its vulnerabilities. He discovered they were holding Lyra there. He couldn't hear her mind. She was too deep within their sterile technology, but he could feel her absence in the G-Mind, a focused, aching void that was centered on the largest dome in the complex. That was the medical and research wing. That was where Dr. Thorne was undoubtedly trying to dissect her connection to quantify the soul of his world. The thought filled him with a cold, clear rage that was as sharp as obsidian. The rage gave him focus. He found his weapon not in a plant or an animal, but in the blight itself. The null spores the consortium used were a masterpiece of biotechnology, designed to sever the G-Mind's connections with absolute efficiency. But Kalen, feeling the blight as a constant pain, began to study its structure, its resonant frequency. He realized it wasn't just a poison, it was a signal, a jamming frequency that overwhelmed the natural psychic network, and like any signal, it could theoretically be redirected, even mimicked. He found what he was looking for in a bog, miles from the outpost, a species of slime mold, the echo mold, that the G-Mind used to create psychic dead zones of its own to isolate and contain natural plagues. The mold was a biological curiosity, a living signal jammer. It was incredibly dangerous to work with. Prolonged exposure could permanently damage an Athelan's connection. But Kalen was desperate. For weeks, he worked, carefully cultivating the mold, feeding it specific minerals to alter its properties, and using his own psychic energy to tune its resonant frequency. It was agonizing work. He had to hold the chaotic, life-destroying frequency of the null spores in his mind and teach the echo mold to replicate it, to sing the song of death. He was creating a biological ghost, a psychic invisibility cloak. Finally, he was ready. He smeared the now-tuned, inert paste of the echo mold over his body, covering his skin, his clothes, his hair. As the mold activated, he felt a sickening lurch as his connection to the G-Mind was severed. For the first time in his life, he was truly alone, a hole in the world, just like the specters had been. The silence was terrifying, a profound sensory deprivation that left him feeling blind and deaf. But he knew it was his only way in. He moved under the cover of a storm he had encouraged the day before, a final gift from the G-Mind before he cloaked himself. The outpost's energy shields shimmered under the assault of the rain, designed to stop projectiles and energy blasts, but not a lone figure walking through the mud. The automated defenses, The sonic sensors, the bioscanners, they all passed over him as if he weren't there. He was a ghost, invisible to both the planet and its invaders. He slipped through a maintenance conduit. The cold, recycled air, a stark contrast to the living breath of the forest. Inside, the outpost was a maze of sterile white corridors, humming with the quiet, indifferent pulse of technology. The silence in his mind was now his shield, allowing him to move without psychic detection. He was just another shadow in a world of artificial light. Using the map in his memory, he made his way towards the research dome. He moved with a predator's grace, his senses honed by his time in the wild. He could smell the ozone from a nearby power conduit, feel the vibrations of a heavy cargo lift through the soles of his feet. He was a creature of the forest, and this sterile jungle was just another landscape to be navigated. He reached the research wing and found it more heavily guarded. Human soldiers in white armor stood at every junction. He couldn't fight them, not head on. He needed a distraction. He found it in the facility's sanitation system. He located a primary waste reclamation duct and, using a sliver of sharpened rock he'd brought with him, pried open a control panel. He didn't understand the complex circuitry, but he understood pressure. He jammed the rock into a series of relays, shorting them out. Alarms blared, not security alarms, but low-priority maintenance alerts. A sanitation failure. It was perfect. Guards were diverted, their attention drawn to the minor, mundane emergency. In the confusion, he slipped past the main checkpoint and into the medical bay. The bay was a nightmare. Ethylan creatures, some he recognized, others from distant parts of the world he'd only felt through the G-mind, were held in glowing stasis fields. Wires and probes disappeared into their bodies, their vital signs displayed on cold, blue screens. It was a library of stolen life. And in the center of the room, on a raised platform, was Lyra. She was floating within a complex sphere of machinery, her eyes closed, her face serene, but a dozen silver threads were attached to her temples, feeding data into a massive console where Dr. Eris Thorne stood watching the readouts. Thorne didn't even turn as Kalen entered. "Remarkable," the doctor said, his voice calm, conversational. "Her mind, it's not a single entity. It's a nexus, a biological router connected to a planetary network of staggering complexity. The processing power is astronomical." Kalen felt a surge of pure hatred. He took a step forward, his hand reaching for the obsidian knife at his belt. "I was wondering when you'd arrive." Thorne continued, finally turning. His eyes, magnified by his spectacles, held no fear, only a detached, academic interest. The echo mold, a clever application of a localized signal jammer. I've been studying it myself. Did you know it operates on a quantum entanglement principle? Fascinating. The doors hissed shut behind Kalen. Specters materialized from the walls, their weapons trained on him. He was trapped. "You came for your teacher," Thorne said, a thin smile playing on his lips. "But you've brought me something so much more valuable. You, the catalyst. The one who doesn't just receive the signal, but can send it. With her," he gestured to Lyra, "I can read the book. With you, I can write a new chapter." Kalen stood his ground, his heart pounding. He was surrounded, cut off from his world, his only power a cloak of silence. But as he looked at Lyra, peaceful even in her violation, he knew the silence was not just a shield. It was a blank slate. Thorn thought he had captured the author. He was about to learn that he had just handed him a pen. Thorn's confidence was a tangible thing, an atmospheric pressure in the sterile room. He saw Kalen not as a threat, but as the final or crucial piece of his research. "Don't be alarmed," he said, his voice maddeningly reasonable. "This is a momentous occasion. We are on the verge of the greatest discovery in human history, quantifiable, planetary-scale consciousness. You and your teacher are not prisoners. You are pioneers." Kalen's hand tightened on his knife. "We are not your lab rats." Thorn adjusted his spectacles, his gaze analytical. "Of course not. You are the Rosetta Stone. For generations, your people have been suffering from the blight. Have you not a slow, entropic decay of your Gaia mind? We've studied it. It's a naturally occurring neurodegenerative disease on a planetary scale. Fascinating. My null spores are simply a more efficient version of what nature has already started. I am not destroying your world, Kalen. I am euthanizing it to study the body." The casual cruelty of the words stole Kalen's breath. The blight wasn't just a sickness. It was a slow, agonizing murder that had been happening for centuries. And Thorn was merely the one who had arrived to pull the plug and perform the autopsy. The specters shifted, their weapons humming with latent energy, ready to fire at the slightest provocation. Kalen knew a physical attack was hopeless. He was trapped in a cage of steel and logic. But Lyra had taught him that the strongest cages have the weakest locks, and Thorn, for all his genius, had a blind spot. He saw the Gaia mind as a network, a biological computer. He did not understand that it was also a spirit, a being with a will of its own. Kalen let his hand fall from his knife. He relaxed his stance, forcing the tension from his shoulders. He looked at the console displaying Lyra's brain activity, the frantic, complex lines of data scrolling across the screen. Thorn was reading her memories, her knowledge, everything that made her a weaver. But reading is a passive act. Kalen decided to give him something to watch. The echo mold on his skin made him a ghost, a psychic blank. He couldn't project outwards to the Gaia mind, but he could project inwards. He closed his eyes, and instead of trying to break through the silence, he embraced it. He turned his consciousness into a perfect mirror. He began to broadcast, not a message, but a reflection. He took the cold, analytical frequency of the consortium's technology, the hum of the lights, the pulse of the stasis fields, the electronic chatter of the Spectre's targeting systems, and mimicked it perfectly. He became a psychic echo of the room itself. On Thorn's console, the data stream from Lyra's mind abruptly changed. The organic, chaotic patterns of her thoughts were suddenly overwritten by a clean, repeating signal. It was the outpost's own operational frequency, being fed back into the system. Thorn frowned, leaning closer to the screen. "An anomaly," he muttered. "A feedback loop. The connection must be unstable." He began tapping at the console, trying to isolate the corrupted data. Kalen intensified his broadcast. He stopped just reflecting the room and began reflecting Thorn himself. He focused on the doctor's mind, on the cold, precise patterns of his logic, his ambition, his boundless curiosity. He didn't try to fight it or corrupt it. He simply copied it, amplified it, and beamed it directly at the silver threads connected to Lyra's temples. The feedback loop became a tidal wave. Thorn's console screamed a high-pitched alarm as its processors were overwhelmed by a perfect, infinite reflection of their own logic. The data wasn't corrupt. It was simply too much. A snake eating its own tail with terrifying speed. Sparks flew from the console. The stasis fields holding the captive creatures flickered and died. The Spectre's targeting systems went haywire, their helmets displaying a cascade of nonsensical data. What is this Thorn demanded, backing away from the smoking console. It's impossible. In that moment of technological chaos, Kalen moved. He wasn't a weaver now. He was a hunter from the Cinderwood. He lunged forward, not at Thorn, but at the power conduit feeding the machine that held Lyra. He plunged his obsidian knife into the thick, armored cable. The blade, a piece of the planet's volcanic heart, conducted the raw energy of the outpost. A violent surge of blue-white electricity erupted, throwing Kalen across the room. His world exploded in pain and light, the echo mold on his skin vaporizing in an instant. The silence in his mind shattered. The Gaia mind, which had been a gaping void, rushed back in with the force of a tsunami. It was a cacophony of pain, rage, and a billion voices screaming at once. The outpost's security systems, fried by the power surge, went into full lockdown. Red lights flashed, klaxons blared, and blast doors began to descend. The machine holding Lyra went dark, the silver threads retracting as she slumped, unconscious, to the platform. Thorn stared, his face a mask of disbelief. His perfect laboratory was in ruins. His priceless specimen had fought back, not with psychic power, but with his own technology. Contain them, he shrieked at the disoriented specters. But Kalen was already moving. The pain from the electrocution was a fire in his veins. But the returning flood of the Gaia mind was a river of strength. He scooped Lyra into his arms. She was terrifyingly light and ran. The freed creatures of Ethel, driven by instinct and a terror of this sterile place, were causing chaos in the corridors, buying him precious seconds. He didn't need a map now. The Gaia mind was his guide. It showed him the path, not through the main corridors, but through the guts of the station. He smashed through a ventilation grate and plunged into the dark, cramped tunnels of the air recycling system. Behind him, he could hear the methodical tramp of the Spectre's boots and the angry shouts of human soldiers. He was no longer a ghost. He was the primary target, and the entire outpost was now a hunting ground. He ran. Lyra, a dead weight in his arms. The Gaia mind, a roaring symphony of guidance and warning in his head. It showed him a structural weakness in a wall, a place where he could break through to a lower maintenance level. He kicked with all his strength, the metal groaning and then bursting outwards. They tumbled into a cavernous, dark space filled with the rumble of massive water pumps. The specters were right behind him, their helmet lights cutting through the gloom. He was cornered. He laid Lyra down gently behind a large pump. Her breathing was shallow. He had to end this. He stood to face the specters, and this time he did not hide. He opened himself fully to the Gaia mind, not as a supplicant, but as a weapon, a conduit for the planet's rage. "You wanted to study the body," Kalen roared, his voice amplified by the acoustics of the chamber. "Now you face its immune system." The specters raised their rifles, but before they could fire, the very foundations of the outpost shuddered. Kalen wasn't asking for vines or insects. He was speaking to the deep rock, to the water, to the immense pressure flowing through the pipes around him. The main water intake valve, a meter-thick slab of reinforced durasteel, exploded inwards. A torrent of raw, unfiltered ethylene river water, thick with sediment and angry, unseen life, burst into the chamber. It slammed into the specters, tossing them like dolls against the far wall. The chamber was flooding, the water rising with terrifying speed. Kalen grabbed Lyra, holding her head above the churning, muddy water. The Gaia mind showed him the way, an outflow pipe, leading back out into the forest. He swam towards it, his lungs burning, the current trying to pull him under. He reached the pipe and hauled himself and Lyra inside, the water pulling them through the darkness. They were shot out of the pipe into a rain-swollen creek in the heart of the forest, miles from the dying outpost. The claxons of Outpost Prime were a faint, dying scream on the wind. Kalen lay on the muddy bank, gasping for air, Lyra beside him. He had done it. He had escaped. He looked back at the faint, angry red glow on the horizon. He had torn a wound in the consortium's heart, but his victory was incomplete. He had rescued his teacher, but he hadn't saved his world. Thorn was still alive. The progenitor still hung in his sky like a death sentence. And now, he had declared war. A war his people, scattered and weakened, were not ready to fight. As Lyra began to stir, her eyelids fluttering, Kalen knew his journey was not over. It had just entered a new, far more dangerous phase. He was no longer the hunted. He was the insurgency. The war began not with a bang, but with a whisper. Kalen, carrying a still weak Lyra, did not return to his village. He took her to the great grove, the sentient heart of the forest where the ancient trees held the collective memory of their world. Here, sheltered by the living titans, Lyra began to heal, her mind slowly reweaving its frayed connections to the Gaia mind. But the Lyra who awoke was not the same teacher Kalen had known. Her ordeal inside Thorn's machine had changed her. She had seen the cold, sterile logic of the human mind from the inside, and it had instilled in her a hard, pragmatic clarity. "They will not stop," she said, her voice raspy, as she sat leaning against the trunk of a tree that was old when the mountains were young. Thorn does not see this as a defeat. He sees it as a new data set. He will adapt his methods. He will come for the grove. Kalen felt a familiar surge of anger. Then we will fight him here. The grove is the strongest part of the world. It will defend itself. It will try, Lyra corrected gently. And it will die. A fortress is useless if the enemy can simply poison the ground it stands on. We cannot win by defending. Kalen, we can only win by attacking. Her words were a profound shift in Ethelan philosophy. Their people had never been conquerors. They were guardians, symbiotic partners with their world. The concept of a proactive, offensive war was as alien as Thorn's technology, but Lyra had seen the future through the enemy's eyes. A future of vivisection and sterile archives where their world would exist only as lines of code. The whisper of war began to spread through the Gaia mind. Kalen, now a reluctant leader, became its voice. He traveled from clan to clan, not as a boy weaver, but as a warrior forged in the enemy's fire. He showed them the memories he'd gleaned from the Gaia mind's brief, violent connection with the outpost's systems, images of their sacred creatures caged, their world's lifeblood being cataloged for termination. He spoke of Lyra's words, of a war that must be fought not on their terms, but on the enemy's. There was resistance. Borin, his arm now healed, but his pride still shattered, argued for a glorious defense. We are of Ethel. We do not run and hide. We do not strike like cowards in the night, But Kalen had an answer. Where the vines that held your harvester cowards was the swarm that melted its heart. The world does not fight with honor. Born, it fights to survive. It is time we learned to do the same. His words, backed by the quiet, unyielding authority of Lyra, began to turn the tide. The clans united not as a single army, but as a single planetary immune response. Warriors learned to fight alongside weavers, their spears and claws guided by the subtle whispers of the Gaia mind. They learned to create distractions in the west to draw consortium patrols, while a single cloaked weaver sabotaged a supply line in the east. They learned to use the planet's own life as a weapon of terrifying efficiency. They became ghosts, insurgents, a rebellion fueled by the will of a dying world. Kalen was their nexus. He coordinated the attacks, his mind the central hub for a dozen skirmishes at once. He guided swarms of razor wings to down consortium drones, their wings slicing through metal with sickening ease. He fermented toxic bogs to release clouds of corrosive gas, forcing Thorn to constantly refit his soldiers with new filtration systems. He became a master of biological warfare, turning every living thing, from the smallest microbe to the largest canyon beast, into a potential soldier. High above, in the cold, clean silence of the progenitor, Dr. Eris Thorn was incandescent with frustration and delight. His outpost was in ruins, his timetable shattered, but the data he was gathering was beyond his wildest dreams. The Athalans were learning, adapting, evolving their tactics at an exponential rate. The Weaver Boy was not just a catalyst. He was a general, commanding a planetary-scale army with a speed and efficiency that no human command structure could ever hope to match. Thorn abandoned the idea of surgical harvesting. This was no longer a dissection. It was a live combat stress test of the most complex biological system he had ever encountered. He deployed new weapons, new countermeasures. He released targeted retroviruses designed to attack the symbiotic flora in the Ethelans' blood, forcing the Weavers to divert their energy to healing their own people. He created sonic pylons that broadcast a dissonant frequency, creating agonizing dead zones that inflicted not just silence, but psychic pain. The war became a brutal, escalating chess match between technology and biology, with the soul of a planet as the prize. Kalen felt the strain of it all. He was the nerve center of the resistance, and he felt every loss, every casualty, every inch of poisoned ground as a personal wound. The constant connection to a world in agony was wearing him down, his body growing gaunt, his eyes holding the ancient weariness of a dying god. Lyra, now acting as his advisor and confidant, saw the toll it was taking. "You are trying to be the entire ocean, Kalen," she told him one night, as he stared into a fire, his face illuminated by the dancing flames. "You must learn to be a single, powerful wave. You cannot win this war by attrition. You will break before he does." "Then what do we do?" "Lyra," he asked, his voice raw with exhaustion. "We give him what he wants." The plan was insane, a final desperate gamble. Thorn wanted the ultimate data set, the key to the entire Gaia mind. He wanted the source code. Lyra proposed they give it to him, but in a form he could never hope to control. The target was the progenitor itself. While Kalen and the Ethelan warriors launched the largest, most direct assault they had ever attempted on the rebuilt consortium outposts, a massive, planet-wide feint, Lyra would lead a small team of the strongest weavers to the base of the tallest mountain on Aethel, the Spire, whose peak scraped the edge of space. There, they would perform a ritual, a deep communion that would open a direct, unfiltered conduit between the Gaia Mind's fiery, primordial core and the orbiting human ship. It was a suicide mission. To channel that much raw power would burn out a weaver's mind, reducing them to an empty shell. But it was their only chance. The assault began. Every warrior, every creature, every living thing that could fight was thrown against the consortium. Kalen led the charge, his mind a burning sun of strategic fury, pushing the human forces to their absolute limit, focusing all of Thorn's attention on the fires raging across the planet's surface. Thorn was ecstatic. The Aethelans were finally committing to a conventional battle, a battle their biology could not possibly win against his technology. He diverted power from the progenitor's upper-level research systems to its tactical shields and ground-based weaponry, eager to crush this final, glorious uprising and collect the spoils. And that was the opening Lyra needed. At the peak of the spire, as the storm of battle raged below, she and her weavers joined hands. They closed their eyes and reached down, past the pain of the forest, past the slow dreams of the mountains, into the molten, chaotic, and utterly alien consciousness of the planet's core. And they opened the floodgates. On the bridge of the progenitor, alarms shrieked. Every console lit up with incomprehensible data. It was not an attack. It was an upload, a torrent of pure, raw, planetary consciousness poured into the ship's systems. It was a billion years of evolution, a trillion voices screaming at once. It was the joy of the first flower, the terror of the great extinction, the slow, patient thought of a continental plate. It was everything, all at once. The ship's AI, a pinnacle of human engineering, tried to parse the data, tried to catalog it, and in a nanosecond, it was driven completely and utterly insane. The progenitor systems went haywire. Life support failed. Gravity fluctuated. The ship began to tear itself apart from the inside. Its own technology turned against it by a force it could not comprehend. Doctor. Eris Thorn stood on his bridge, watching his life's work collapse around him, a look of sublime, ecstatic horror on his face. He was finally seeing the soul of the world, and it was burning him alive. The great black ship, the judgment that had hung in their sky for so long, began to fracture. It did not explode, but rather bloomed. Strange, crystalline structures grew from its hull. Its lights shifted from sterile white to 1,000 vibrant, living colors. It was no longer a machine. It had become a part of Ethel. As the crippled ship drifted, a new, silent moon in the sky. The battle on the ground subsided. The consortium forces, their command structure shattered, their technology failing, were overwhelmed. Kalen stood on a battlefield of broken machines and reclaimed Earth. The Gaia mind humming around him not with rage, but with a deep, profound, and sorrowful peace. He could feel the empty spaces where Lyra and the other weavers had been, their consciousnesses sacrificed to become one with the planet. The blight was still there. The scars of the war would take generations to heal, but the world was theirs once more. He looked up at the transformed progenitor, no longer a symbol of death, but a testament to their victory. A strange and beautiful scar on the heavens. The symphony of his world was bruised and battered, but it was playing again. And Kalen, the boy who had once been a conductor who could not read the music, had finally learned to compose a song of his own. It was a song of survival